The sound of a whip cracked through the air like thunder across the dusty plains of Wyoming Territory, 1873, followed by a woman's desperate cry that stopped drifter Preston Hayes dead in his tracks. He'd been leading his chestnut mare along the edge of a small creek when he heard a sound that didn't belong among the gentle rustling of cottonwood leaves and the distant lowing of cattle. "No more. My ribs are already broken," she wept, her voice carrying on the wind. Preston's hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip. He wasn't looking for trouble, had been avoiding it for most of his 30 years, but some things a man couldn't ride past, not if he aimed to still call himself a man when he laid his head down at night. He tethered his horse to a scrubby bush and moved silently through the brush toward the commotion. The scene that greeted him made his blood run cold. A woman with copper-colored hair lay crumpled at the feet of a barrel-chested man whose face was twisted with rage. 3 other men stood around them, laughing. "You'll fetch what I paid for you one way or another," the large man growled, raising his arm to strike her again. Preston stepped into the clearing, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. I believe the lady said no more, for pairs of eyes snapped in his direction. The woman's green as spring grass and wide with fear and something else. Hope, perhaps, locked onto his face. "This ain't your business, stranger," the large man said, hand moving toward the gun at his side. "This woman's my property. Bought and paid for." "No human being is property," Preston replied evenly, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "Not in my book." The large man spat on the ground. "Your book don't mean much out here. I'm Silas Blackwood, and this here's my land." Preston took a measured step forward, never breaking eye contact with Blackwood. "Name's Preston Hayes, and I don't much care whose land this is. I'm asking you politely to step away from the lady." Blackwood's face reddened. "Boys, teach this fool some manners." What happened next was a blur of violence. Preston had lived rough years on the frontier and survived the war between the states. His movements were automatic, honed by necessity and desperation. When the dust settled, 3 men lay groaning on the ground. Only Blackwood remained standing, his gun half drawn. "You're fast," Blackwood conceded, letting his pistol slide back into its holster. "But this ain't over. That woman cost me $50 from a trader in Kansas City." "Here's 60, Preston said, reaching into his pocket and tossing a small leather pouch at Blackwood's feet. "Now she's free." Blackwood looked down at the money, then back at Preston, calculating. Finally, he bent to pick up the pouch, counted the coins, and nodded. "She's more trouble than she's worth anyway." As Blackwood and his men mounted their horses and rode away, Preston turned to the woman, who was struggling to stand. Her simple dress was torn at the shoulder, and a bruise was blooming on her cheekbone. "Can you walk, madam?" he asked, keeping his distance. "I think so," she whispered, then winced as she tried to straighten up. "My name is Josephine Winters." "Miss Winters," Preston acknowledged with a slight tip of his hat. "Do you have somewhere safe to go?" Josephine's eyes filled with tears.
"No,
They took me from the stagecoach 3 days ago. I was heading to Laramie to take a teaching position." Preston's jaw tightened. He'd seen too many innocent lives destroyed by the lawlessness of the frontier. "I have a camp nearby. You can rest there while we figure out what to do next." As he helped Josephine to her feet, she gasped in pain. "My ribs," she explained, a single tear tracking down her dusty cheek. "I'll go slow," he promised, supporting her weight as they made their way back to where his horse waited. That night, by the light of a small fire, Preston learned Josephine's story. 22 years old, orphaned by fever 2 years prior, she had sold her family's small farm in Ohio to seek a new life in the West. Her credentials as a teacher had secured her a position in Laramie, but fate had cruelly intervened. "Why did you help me?" she asked as he handed her a tin cup of coffee. "You could have been killed." Preston stared into the flames, considering her question. "Some things a man can't ride past," he said simply. "Get some rest, Miss Winters. We've got a long ride to Laramie tomorrow." But when morning came, Josephine could barely move. Her ribs, at least one broken from Blackwood's beating, had stiffened overnight. Preston knew they couldn't travel, not with her in such pain. "We'll stay here today," he decided. "There's a town about 15 miles north. Silver Creek. I'll ride in for supplies and see if there's a doctor." Fear flashed across Josephine's face. What if they come back? Preston pulled his spare revolver from his saddlebag and placed it beside her. "You know how to use this?" Josephine nodded. Her father had taught her, believing no woman should be defenseless on the frontier. "I'll be back before sundown," Preston promised. Silver Creek was like 100 other frontier towns Preston had passed through, a wide dirt street lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon doing brisk business even in the morning hours, and wary eyes following a stranger's movements. He located a doctor, purchased supplies, and was heading back to his horse when a hand clamped down on his shoulder. "You the fella who crossed Silas Blackwood yesterday?" The voice belonged to a weathered man wearing a sheriff's badge. Preston tensed. "I helped a woman in trouble. If that crossed someone, so be it." The sheriff's grip tightened. "Blackwood's got friends in this county. Powerful friends. He says you stole something of his." "I paid him fair," Preston countered. "And people aren't property." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Where is she?" "Safe. Blackwood's offering $200 for her return. And $100 for the man who took her." The sheriff leaned closer. "I could use that money." Preston's hand moved imperceptibly toward his gun. "You'd sell a woman back to a monster for coin?" The sheriff released Preston's shoulder and stepped back. "Just delivering the message. You'd be wise to keep riding, mister. Don't stop until you're out of Wyoming." Preston knew the sheriff was right, but he couldn't abandon Josephine. She was hurt, alone, and Blackwood wouldn't stop looking for her, not because he wanted her specifically, but because his pride had been wounded. When Preston returned to camp, he found Josephine sitting up, the revolver across her lap, her face pale but determined. "We need to move," he said without preamble, dismounting and gathering their few belongings. "Blackwood's put a price on our heads." Josephine's face fell. "This is my fault. You should leave me in Silver Creek. I'll find my way to Laramie somehow." Preston shook his head. "Blackwood's got allies there. You wouldn't make it a day." He hesitated, then added, "I know a place. An old friend has a ranch near the Montana border. We'd be safe there while you heal." "Why would you do this?" Josephine asked, searching his face. "You don't know me." Preston couldn't answer her directly. The truth was, he didn't fully understand it himself. Something about Josephine's courage in the face of cruelty had stirred something in him, something he thought had died years ago on a bloody battlefield in Virginia. "We should go," he said instead. "Can you ride?" It took them 4 days to reach Patrick McAllister's ranch, traveling slowly due to Josephine's injuries and taking circuitous routes to avoid main roads. Each night, Preston kept watch, gun at the ready, certain that Blackwood's men would find them. During those long days and longer nights, a tentative trust formed between them. Josephine told Preston about her dreams of educating frontier children, of building a life where she answered to no one. Preston shared less, but what he did reveal glimpses of a bloody war, a failed marriage to a woman who couldn't bear the solitude of his wandering nature. Years spent moving from job to job painted a picture of a man who had seen too much, but hadn't yet surrendered to bitterness. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking McAllister's ranch, Preston felt something like hope for the first time in years. Patrick McAllister, a big Scotsman with a wild red beard streaked with gray, welcomed them with open arms. His wife, Martha, a no-nonsense woman with kind eyes, immediately took Josephine under her wing, clucking over her injuries and setting her up in their spare bedroom. "You're in a heap of trouble, I reckon," Patrick said to Preston that night as they sat on the porch, passing a bottle of whiskey between them. "Seems that way," Preston admitted. Patrick studied his old friend's face. Must be quite a woman to make Preston Hayes stick his neck out. Preston said nothing, but his eyes drifted to the window where lamplight glowed from Josephine's room. "Stay as long as you need," Patrick offered. "Got plenty of work if you're looking to earn your keep." For the next 2 weeks, Preston fell into the rhythm of ranch life while Josephine recovered. He mended fences, broke horses, and helped drive a small herd to a neighboring property. Each evening, he would return to find Josephine a little stronger, her smile a little brighter. She had charmed the McAllistons completely, helping Martha with household tasks and teaching their 2 young children reading and arithmetic. Preston tried to keep his distance, knowing that their paths would inevitably diverge once she was well enough to continue to Laramie. But something kept drawing him back to her laugh, perhaps, or the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of her plans for the future. One evening, as he sat on the porch cleaning his rifle, Josephine joined him, moving more easily than she had in days. "Martha says my ribs are healing well," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "I should be able to travel soon." Preston's hands stilled on the rifle. "That's good news." "Is it?" Her voice was soft, questioning. He looked up, finding her eyes in the fading light. "You still want to go to Laramie?" "I don't know anymore." Josephine sighed. "Martha received a letter from her sister today. Word has spread about a woman who escaped from Silas Blackwood. There are men looking for us as far as Cheyenne." Preston set the rifle aside. "Blackwood doesn't strike me as a man who gives up easily." "No," Josephine agreed. "And I've been thinking, maybe teaching isn't my path anymore. At least, not in Laramie. What would you do instead?" She looked out at the rolling hills, painted gold by the setting sun. "I'm not sure, but I know I don't want to spend my life looking over my shoulder." Preston understood that feeling all too well. "What about you?" she asked. "Will you move on once I'm gone?" The question hung in the air between them. Preston had never stayed in one place for long, not since the war. The open road had been his only constant companion. But the thought of riding away from Josephine left a hollow feeling in his chest. Before he could answer, the sound of approaching horses broke the stillness. Patrick emerged from the house, a shotgun in his hands. "Get inside," he told them, his voice tense. "Now." Preston grabbed his rifle and followed Josephine into the house. Through the window, he counted 6 riders approaching the ranch. Even in the dimming light, he recognized Blackwood's hulking form at the lead. "They found us," Josephine whispered, her face pale. Martha ushered her children upstairs, then returned with a revolver of her own. "This is our home," she said firmly. "Nobody's taking anyone from it." Patrick positioned himself by the front door, while Preston took the back. Josephine, despite Martha's protests, insisted on staying downstairs, gun in hand. The riders stopped in the yard. Blackwood's voice boomed across the evening air. "McAllister, I know you're harboring fugitives. Send them out, and we'll leave your family be." Patrick called back, "There are no fugitives here, Blackwood. Just guests. And you're trespassing on private property." "That woman belongs to me," Blackwood shouted. "And the man with her is wanted for assault and theft." "Nobody belongs to anyone," Patrick replied. "And I suggest you leave before this gets ugly." A shot rang out, splintering wood near the front window. Martha gasped, and Preston's grip tightened on his rifle. "We have you outnumbered," Blackwood called. "Send them out, or we burn this place to the ground." Preston looked at Josephine, saw the fear and determination warring in her eyes. Then he made a decision. "I'm going out there," he said quietly. "No." Josephine moved toward him. "They'll kill you." "They might try," Preston said. "But I won't let them hurt anyone else because of me." Patrick blocked his path. "This isn't just your fight anymore, Preston. These men need to learn they can't terrorize decent folk." More shots peppered the house, and glass shattered somewhere upstairs. Martha ran to check on her children. "I have an idea," Josephine said suddenly. "Patrick, do you still have connections with the territorial marshal?" Patrick nodded. "Jim Reynolds. He owes me a favor or two. If we can hold Blackwood off until morning, could you get word to him?" Patrick considered this. "My ranch hand, Tommy, could ride out the back way. Reynolds has men in Sheridan, less than a day's ride." A plan began to form. They would defend the ranch through the night, buying time for Tommy to fetch the marshal. If they could make it until help arrived, Blackwood would finally face justice for his crimes. As night fell, Blackwood's men made several attempts to approach the house, but well-placed shots from Preston and Patrick kept them at bay. By midnight, an uneasy stalemate had developed. Blackwood and his men had retreated to the edge of the property, but showed no signs of leaving. In the tense quiet of the early morning hours, Preston found Josephine at the kitchen window, peering into the darkness. "You should rest," he told her. "I can't." She turned to face him. "Preston, I need to tell you something." "If we don't make it through this, we will," he interrupted. "Please," she insisted. "I need to say this." She took a deep breath. "When you found me that day, I had given up. I thought my life was over. But you gave me hope again. And these past weeks, they've meant more to me than I can say." Preston stepped closer, drawn by the vulnerability in her voice. "Josephine, I know you're not one to stay in one place," she continued, "and I don't expect anything from you. But I wanted you to know that whatever happens, meeting you changed me." In the dim light of the kitchen, with danger surrounding them, Preston did something he hadn't planned. He reached out and took her hand. "It changed me too." Before Josephine could respond, a shout came from outside. Blackwood's patience had run out. "We're coming in, McAllister." Last chance to send them out. Patrick joined them in the kitchen, his face grim. "Tommy should have reached Sheridan by now, if Reynolds moves quickly." A sudden crash from the front of the house cut him off. They rushed to the main room to find Martha backing away from the door, which was splintering under the weight of something heavy. "They're using a battering ram," Patrick said, raising his shotgun. Preston positioned himself in front of Josephine. "Get upstairs with the children," he told her. "I'm staying," she insisted, raising her revolver. The door gave way with a final crash and chaos erupted. Gunfire filled the small room, smoke clouding the air. Preston fired methodically, downing one of Blackwood's men immediately. Patrick's shotgun blast caught another in the chest. But they were outnumbered. A bullet grazed Preston's arm, and another took Patrick in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Martha fired from the stairs, striking a third attacker, but then Blackwood himself burst through the doorway, a pistol in each hand. "Enough," he roared, firing into the ceiling. "Drop your weapons, or the next shot goes through the woman." Preston hesitated, his rifle trained on Blackwood's chest. He could take the shot, but Blackwood's men would cut them down in seconds. "Please," Josephine said, stepping out from behind Preston. "No one else needs to get hurt."
"Josephine, no," Preston whispered.
But she had made her decision. She placed her revolver on the floor and walked forward, hands raised. "I'll go with you, Mr. Blackwood. Just leave these people alone." Blackwood smiled, an ugly twist of his mouth. "Smart girl. But I'm afraid it's too late for your boyfriend here. He's caused me too much trouble." He raised his pistol toward Preston, who stood his ground, refusing to drop his rifle. The shot that rang out didn't come from Blackwood's gun. It came from behind him, from outside the broken door. Blackwood's expression changed from triumph to confusion as a red stain spread across his chest. He toppled forward, revealing a tall figure standing in the doorway, Marshal Jim Reynolds, flanked by 4 deputies. "Drop your weapons," Reynolds commanded Blackwood's remaining men. "Or join your boss." In the aftermath, as the sun rose over the McAllister ranch, Preston sat on the porch steps, his wounded arm bandaged. Josephine sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his knee. "It's over," she said softly. "Reynolds says Blackwood had warrants in 3 territories. His men will stand trial." Preston nodded, too exhausted for words. The night had nearly cost them everything, but they had survived. "What will you do now?" he asked finally. Josephine looked out at the dawn-lit landscape. "I don't know. The teaching position in Laramie is probably filled by now." "Martha mentioned they need a teacher in Sheridan," Preston offered. "It's a growing town. Might be a good place to start fresh." Josephine studied his face. "And you? Will you be moving on?" Preston had been asking himself the same question since the shooting stopped. His whole life had been about movement, about never staying long enough to form attachments that could be broken. But something had changed. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "that Sheridan might need more than just a teacher. McAllister mentioned his friend has a horse ranch there that needs a manager." Hope bloomed in Josephine's eyes. "You'd stay in Sheridan?" "I might," Preston said, allowing himself a small smile. "If I had a good reason." 3 months later, the schoolhouse in Sheridan rang with children's voices as Josephine concluded the day's lessons. At 23 pupils, her class had grown steadily since she'd taken the position. The town was booming, with new families arriving each week to stake their claim in the fertile valley. As the children filed out, Josephine gathered her books and papers, wincing slightly as she reached for her shawl. Though her ribs had healed, they sometimes ached when the weather changed, a permanent reminder of her ordeal. Outside, Preston waited on horseback, leading a second mount, a gentle mare he had trained specifically for Josephine. In the months since they had settled in Sheridan, he had transformed Walter Cunningham's struggling horse ranch into a profitable enterprise, earning a reputation for his skill with even the most difficult animals. "How are the young scholars today?" he asked as Josephine approached. "Full of energy," she replied, accepting his hand as she mounted her horse. "Mrs. Peterson's twins nearly turned my hair gray." Preston laughed, a sound that had become more frequent as the shadows of their past receded. They rode side by side through the bustling main street, nodding to shopkeepers and townspeople who had come to accept them as fixtures in the community. Life in Sheridan wasn't perfect. Rumors of their confrontation with Blackwood had followed them, and some still viewed them with suspicion. But they had found allies too: Marshal Reynolds, who had recommended Preston for the ranch position, the town doctor and his wife, who had welcomed Josephine into their social circle, and the families of her students, grateful for her dedication to their children's education. And they had found something else: a tentative happiness in each other's company. Preston had rented a small cabin on the edge of town, while Josephine boarded with the doctor's family. Several evenings a week, they would share a meal at the town's only restaurant or take a ride into the surrounding countryside. They were careful, proper, mindful of Josephine's position as the town's teacher. But the connection that had formed during their flight from Blackwood had only strengthened with time. As they reached the edge of town, Preston guided their horses toward a ridge overlooking the valley. It was their favorite spot, where the vast expanse of the Wyoming Territory stretched before them, wild and beautiful. "I received a letter today," Preston said as they dismounted. "From Patrick McAllister." "How are they?" Josephine asked eagerly. She had grown fond of the McAllisters during their brief stay. "Doing well. Martha's expecting again." Preston hesitated. "And Patrick mentioned something else. Blackwood's trial ended last week. He'll hang in Cheyenne next month." Josephine was quiet for a moment, absorbing the news. "I should feel relief, I suppose. But you don't." She shook her head. "I just feel sad. Sad that a man could become so twisted that he thought owning another person was his right." Preston understood. The violence of their encounter with Blackwood had left marks deeper than physical wounds. Patrick also wrote that the territorial governor has issued a proclamation against human trafficking. Blackwood's case brought attention to the problem. Then perhaps some good came of it after all, Josephine said softly. They stood in companionable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Preston had been carrying a question for weeks now, searching for the right moment, the right words. Josephine, he began, his voice unusually hesitant. I've been thinking a lot about the future. She turned to face him, her copper hair catching the dying light. Have you? Yes. He took a deep breath. I've never been one for putting down roots. After the war, staying in one place felt like slowly dying. But these past months in Sheridan with you, it's different. Josephine's eyes widened. Different how? I find myself thinking about tomorrow, and the day after, and the year after that. I find myself wanting those days to include you. A slow smile spread across Josephine's face. Preston Hayes, are you saying you'd like to court me properly? I'm saying more than that, he replied, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small object. I'm asking if you'd consider becoming my wife. The ring was simple, a gold band with a small pearl, but it represented everything Preston had never thought he'd want. Permanence, commitment, a shared future. Josephine's hands trembled as she took the ring, examining it in the fading light. Where did you get this? It was my mother's, Preston explained. The only thing of hers I kept. Tears filled Josephine's eyes. Are you certain? Your life has been about freedom, about moving on whenever the urge struck. Marriage is the opposite of that? Preston smiled. Maybe that's what I need, what I want. A reason to stay, to build something that lasts. He took her hand. I love you, Josephine Winters. I think I have since I found you by that creek, defiant even when you were broken. I love you too, she whispered, the words carrying easily in the still evening air. Yes, Preston. Yes, I'll marry you. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Preston felt a sense of rightness, of coming home after a long journey. It wasn't the end of adventure life in the Wyoming Territory would ensure that, but the beginning of a different kind, one they would face together. Their wedding took place on a crisp autumn day, with the aspen trees turning gold in the high country. The entire town turned out for the celebration, held in the newly completed church. Marshall Reynolds stood as Preston's best man, while the doctor's wife attended Josephine. Patrick and Martha McAllister made the journey from their ranch, bringing their children and a magnificent quilt as a wedding gift. As Josephine walked down the aisle in a dress of ivory silk ordered specially from Denver, Preston thought she had never looked more beautiful. The bruises from Blackwood's cruelty had long since faded, and in their place was a confident young woman who had faced darkness and emerged stronger. The reception lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing in the town square. As the newly married couple took their first dance, Josephine leaned close to Preston's ear. Do you remember what you said to me that first day by the creek? She asked. Preston thought back. I believe I said some things a man can't ride past. Josephine smiled. I'm glad you didn't ride past me. Best decision I ever made, he replied, tightening his arm around her waist. Later that night, as they walked to the small house Preston had purchased at the edge of town, their home, now Josephine grew thoughtful. What is it? Preston asked, noticing her expression in the moonlight. I was just thinking about how different my life is from what I imagined when I left Ohio, she said. I thought I was heading to a respectable position as a schoolteacher in Laramie. Instead, I was kidnapped, beaten, rescued by a handsome drifter, chased across the territory, caught in a gunfight, and now I'm married to that same drifter who turns out to be the finest man I've ever known. Preston laughed. When you put it that way, it does sound rather dramatic. Life is dramatic out here, Josephine said, gazing up at the star-filled sky. But I wouldn't change a moment of it, not if it led me to you. As winter descended on Sheridan, Preston and Josephine settled into married life. Their small house became a home, filled with books Josephine ordered for her students and sketches Preston made of horses he planned to breed. On Sundays, they hosted dinner for friends, the doctor and his wife, Marshall Reynolds, when he was in town, young couples new to the area who needed community. Preston's work at the horse ranch prospered. His reputation spread beyond Sheridan, bringing buyers from as far as Denver and Salt Lake City. Josephine continued teaching, introducing innovations like a small library and regular nature excursions that made her school the pride of the county. They faced challenges too. A harsh blizzard in January nearly wiped out Preston's herd, requiring nights spent in the stable keeping the animals alive. An outbreak of scarlet fever closed Josephine's school for weeks and claimed the lives of 2 of her youngest pupils. The frontier remained unforgiving, testing the strength of all who chose to make their lives there. But through it all, Preston and Josephine found in each other a partnership neither had expected. He admired her intelligence and determination. She valued his quiet strength and unfailing honor. Together, they built a life that balanced the freedom Preston had always craved with the stability Josephine needed. Spring brought renewal to the land, and a surprise to their household, Josephine was expecting a child. The news filled Preston with equal parts joy and terror. His own father had been a distant, harsh man, and Preston had few models for the kind of parent he wanted to be. "You're going to be wonderful," Josephine assured him one evening as they sat on their porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. "You have so much love to give." "How can you be so certain?" he asked, his hand resting gently on her still, flat stomach. "Because I've seen how you are with my students, with the McAllister's children. You listen to them. You respect them." She covered his hand with hers. "Our child will be very lucky." As summer turned to fall and Josephine's pregnancy progressed, Preston found himself planning for a future that stretched far beyond the next season. He expanded their house, adding a nursery with a window that faced the mountains. He set aside the finest colt from that year's foals, declaring it would be their child's first mount when the time came. Word reached them in October that Silas Blackwood had been hanged in Cheyenne. His reign of terror finally ended. The news brought a complex mixture of emotions: relief that justice had been served, sadness for the lives Blackwood had damaged, and gratitude that their own story had taken a different path. "Do you ever wonder," Josephine asked that night as they lay in bed, her head on Preston's chest, "what would have happened if you hadn't heard me that day by the creek?" Preston's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I try not to. The thought of you in Blackwood's hands." "I meant what would have happened to you," she clarified. "Would you still be drifting? Never staying anywhere long enough to belong?" Preston considered this. "Probably. I didn't know what I was missing until I found it." In late November, as the first snow dusted the mountains, Josephine went into labor. The birth was difficult, lasting through the night and into the following day. Preston paced outside their bedroom, feeling utterly helpless as the doctor and 2 neighbor women attended to his wife. Her cries tore at his heart, and more than once he had to be physically restrained from bursting into the room. Finally, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow, a new cry joined Josephine's, the indignant wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Preston sank to his knees, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude. When the doctor finally allowed him in, Preston found Josephine pale but radiant, a tiny bundle cradled in her arms. "Come meet your daughter," she said, her voice weak but triumphant. Preston approached the bed cautiously, as if his presence might somehow disrupt the miracle before him. The baby was so small, her face red and scrunched, a wisp of dark hair his coloring, not Josephine's, visible beneath the soft blanket. "Would you like to hold her?" Josephine asked. Preston hesitated. His hands, calloused from years of hard work, seemed too rough for something so delicate. But Josephine was already placing the infant in his arms, showing him how to support her head. As he gazed down at his daughter's face, Preston felt something shift within him, a final surrender of the restlessness that had driven him for so long. In its place was a fierce protective love, a willingness to stand against the entire world if necessary to keep this child safe. "What shall we name her?" Josephine asked softly. Preston thought for a moment. "How about Elizabeth, after your mother?" Josephine's eyes filled with tears. "Elizabeth Hayes. It's perfect." The winter passed in a blur of midnight feedings and quiet discoveries. Elizabeth Eliza, as they began to call her, thrived despite the cold, growing stronger each day. Preston found unexpected joy in the simple routines of fatherhood, rocking Eliza to sleep, bathing her tiny body, watching in wonder as she began to focus on his face and respond to his voice. When spring arrived, bringing new life to the valley, Preston took Josephine and Eliza on a ride to their special ridge. The baby was securely bundled against Josephine's chest as they sat on a blanket, looking out over the land that had become their home. "I never thought I'd find peace here," Preston admitted, watching an eagle soar overhead. "In the West. After the war, I thought I'd spend my life running from memories." "And now?" Josephine asked, stroking Eliza's cheek as the baby slept. "Now I have new memories," he said, smiling at his wife and daughter. "Better ones." As Eliza grew from infant to toddler, their family became a fixture in Sheridan. Preston's horse ranch expanded, employing several local men and developing a breeding program that drew attention throughout the territory. Josephine returned to teaching part-time, bringing Eliza with her to the schoolhouse where the older students delighted in entertaining the precocious child. On Eliza's third birthday, they received a surprise visitor, Marshal Reynolds, now promoted to Chief Marshal for the entire Wyoming Territory. He brought news that the territorial legislature was considering a bill that would formalize women's suffrage, making Wyoming the first place in the nation to grant women the right to vote. "They're calling it the Equality State," Reynolds told them over dinner. "And it's women like you, Mrs. Hayes, who are changing minds. Educated, capable women who prove the old prejudices wrong." Josephine blushed at the compliment. "I'm just teaching children their letters and numbers. And running half the committees in town," Preston added proudly. "The library board, the school expansion project, the vaccination campaign." "Well," Josephine conceded, "someone has to do these things." Reynolds laughed. "Like I said, changing minds." He turned to Preston. "And you, my friend, have a reputation as well. The man who defied Blackwood and lived to tell the tale." Preston shook his head. "That's ancient history now." "Not to everyone," Reynolds said seriously. "What you two did standing up to a man like that when most would have looked the other way, it matters. It sets an example." After Reynolds departed, promising to return for the town's Independence Day celebration, Preston found Josephine standing by Eliza's bed, watching their daughter sleep. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "Getting involved with a troublemaker like me?" Josephine leaned into his embrace. "Never. Although I do sometimes wonder what my life would have been like if I'd made it to Laramie as planned." "Boring," Preston suggested, kissing the top of her head. "Safe, perhaps," she countered, "but not nearly as full." As they prepared for bed that night, Preston watched Josephine brush out her copper hair, still as vibrant as the day they met. 7 years had passed since he had found her broken and weeping by that creek. 7 years of building a life together, facing dangers and celebrating joys, creating a family neither of them had dared to imagine. "What are you thinking about?" Josephine asked, catching his reflection in her mirror. "The day we met," Preston admitted, "when you said your ribs were already broken." Josephine set down her brush and turned to face him. "I was certain I was going to die that day. And then you appeared, like something out of a dime novel, the mysterious stranger who stands up to the villain." Preston crossed the room to her. "I wasn't trying to be heroic. I just couldn't ride past." "I know." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that time had begun to etch around his eyes. "That's what makes you a hero, Preston Hayes. Not that you're fearless, but that you do the right thing even when you're afraid." He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I do have one regret," he confessed. "What's that?" "That you had to suffer before we found each other." Josephine shook her head. "Don't. Those broken ribs led me to you, and you were worth every moment of pain." 5 years later, as Wyoming celebrated its admission to the Union as the 44th state, the Hayes family had grown to include a second child, a son named James, now 4 years old and as adventurous as his father had once been. Eliza, at 8, was already showing signs of her mother's intelligence and her father's quiet determination. Sheridan had grown as well, from a frontier outpost to a proper town with a brick schoolhouse, where Josephine now served as headmistress, a bank, several churches, and a newspaper. Preston's horse ranch had become one of the most successful in the region, and he had recently been elected to the town council, a position he had initially resisted but eventually accepted at Josephine's urging. "You have good ideas," she had insisted, "and people respect you. You could help shape how Sheridan grows." She had been right, as she so often was. Preston found that his experiences both as a drifter who had seen countless towns rise and fall and as a businessman who understood what made communities thrive gave him a unique perspective that others valued. On a warm summer evening, as they hosted a gathering to celebrate Wyoming's statehood, Preston stood on their porch watching Josephine move among their guests. At 39, she remained the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, her copper hair now adorned with strands of silver, her green eyes as bright and compelling as ever. Patrick and Martha McAllister had made the journey for the celebration, bringing their 5 children, the youngest of whom was Eliza's age. Marshall Reynolds was there with his new wife, a widow from Cheyenne with a sharp wit that matched his own. The doctor and his wife, now among their oldest friends, argued good-naturedly about whether Wyoming or Colorado had the more impressive mountains. As Preston surveyed the scene, his children playing with the McAllister brood, Josephine laughing at something Martha had said, the house he had built with his own hands filled with friends who had become family, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. This life, so different from the solitary existence he had once embraced, had not happened by chance. It had begun with a choice to stop when he heard a woman weeping, to stand against cruelty when he could have ridden away, to open his heart when every instinct told him to guard it. "Penny for your thoughts," Josephine said, appearing at his side with 2 glasses of lemonade. Preston accepted one with a smile. "I was just thinking that I'm a fortunate man. Because Wyoming is now officially a state," she teased. "Because I heard you that day," he said simply. "Because you were brave enough to start over. Because we built this life together." Josephine's expression softened. "It hasn't always been easy. The best things rarely are," Preston replied. Later that night, after their guests had departed and their children were asleep, Preston and Josephine sat on their porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the summer darkness. The distant howl of a coyote reminded them that for all of Sheridan's growth, the wilderness was never far away. "Do you remember what you said to Blackwood that day?" Josephine asked, her head resting on Preston's shoulder. "No human being is property." "I remember. I was so certain you would be killed for saying that," she continued. "But you stood there, 1 man against 4, as if the odds didn't matter." Preston chuckled. "Oh, I knew the odds. I just figured some things are worth dying for." Josephine lifted her head to look at him. "I'm glad you didn't die." "So am I," he said, kissing her softly. "So am I." As the years passed, Preston and Josephine watched their children grow into adults with their own dreams and aspirations. Eliza, inheriting her mother's love of learning, attended the newly established University of Wyoming, becoming one of its first female graduates. She returned to Sheridan to teach alongside Josephine, eventually taking over as headmistress, when her mother retired. James, more restless than his sister, spent several years working on the ranch before heading to Denver to study veterinary medicine. His knowledge proved invaluable when he returned, helping Preston develop breeding lines that made Hayes horses sought after throughout the West. By the dawn of the new century, Preston and Josephine had become elder statesmen of Sheridan, their story how a drifter rescued a kidnapped schoolteacher and defied a notorious criminal to protect her part of local lore. Young couples sought their advice. Newcomers to town were directed to their door for welcome, and their opinions carried weight in community decisions. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the town organized a celebration in their honor. The event was held in the town square, with speeches, music, and a dinner that stretched long into the evening. As Preston and Josephine took a turn around the dance floor, he marveled at how the passage of time had only deepened his love for her. 30 years, he murmured as they swayed to the music. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I found you by that creek. And sometimes it feels like we've always been together, Josephine replied. As if my life before you was just preparation. Preston smiled. You're getting philosophical in your old age, Mrs. Hayes. 52 is hardly old, she protested with a laugh. And you're one to talk, Mr. Hayes. You'll be 60 next month. Don't remind me, he groaned. But there was no real dismay in his voice. Age had brought its challenges. His back ached after a long day with the horses, and Josephine's hands had developed the first signs of arthritis, but it had brought wisdom too, and a deep appreciation for the life they had built together. As the dance ended, they found themselves surrounded by their family, Eliza with her husband Frank and their 2 children, James and his wife Sarah, expecting their first child in the spring, and the extended circle of friends who had become as dear as blood relations over the decades. Looking at the faces around them, Preston felt a swell of pride. This was their true legacy, not just their biological children, but all the lives they had touched, all the ways they had helped shape Sheridan into a community where people looked out for one another, where justice and compassion were valued. That night, as they prepared for bed in the house that had been their home for 3 decades, Josephine caught Preston watching her again. "What is it?" she asked, familiar with his contemplative moods. "I was just thinking," he said, "about how many different ways our lives could have gone. If I hadn't heard you that day. If you had made it to Laramie. If Blackwood had caught us. But none of that happened," Josephine reminded him gently. "What happened is that you saved me. We saved each other. And then we built this life, day by day, choice by choice." Preston nodded, drawing her into his arms. "The best choice I ever made was not riding past when I heard you weeping. And the best choice I made was trusting you," Josephine replied, "even when I was broken and afraid." As they held each other in the quiet of their bedroom, surrounded by the mementos of a lifetime shared, both were thinking the same thing, that love, real love, wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about showing up day after day. It was about choosing each other, again and again, through hardship and joy. It was about building something that would outlast them both. "No more. My ribs are already broken," Josephine had wept on that distant day in 1873. And Preston Hayes, a drifter with no home and no plans, had saddled up and defied the whole West for her. Neither could have imagined where that moment would lead, to a marriage that spanned decades, to children and grandchildren, to a legacy of courage and compassion that would be remembered long after they were gone. But that was the beauty of life on the frontier, where each day brought new challenges and new possibilities, where ordinary people could, through small acts of bravery and love, become the heroes of their own enduring story.